Hello, and welcome back to When History is News. I'm Karin Wulf. I'm the director and librarian at the John Carter Brown Library, and I'm so delighted for you to join us again today for this next installment. This virtual series, as you'll know if you've joined us before or if you've caught up on some of the other videos, the idea here is to really put together a resource for folks who have been reading and writing and thinking about history when it is in the news, and particularly in 2026, this year where we're living right now in July of 2026, whenever you are watching it, history, and particularly the history of the American Revolution and the long period of revolution, is in the news just about every day. And so we are super delighted to have a series of stellar scholars join us. This is part of a bigger project on history and journalism. We've been grateful for support from The Atlantic, for example, for this project. And please stay tuned because there will be more iterations of this endeavor to think about the relationship between these two very aligned ways of thinking about information and how we consume it. So today, it is such a pleasure to welcome Chris Bonner. Dr. Bonner specializes in African American history and the 19th century United States. His book, Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship, was published with the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2020. And his work also appears in a variety of other places, including a collection called New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition. He wrote about runaways, rescuers, and the politics of breaking the law. It's such a good piece. Highly recommend that. His work also has appeared in digital form, and I have to say that I first read a lot of his work when he was a very regular contributor to Black Perspectives in the mid 20 teens. I highly recommend looking up some of his contributions there online. Dr. Bonner is a professor of history at the University of Maryland, where he teaches African American history and early American history. He's currently at work on a project considering how enslaved people navigated commercial networks as they sought to gain their freedom in the early 19th century. He's originally from Chesapeake, Virginia. Hello, fellow Virginian. He earned his BA from Howard and his PhD from Yale University. It's just a pleasure to have him here. Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Karin. Thanks so much for having me and for that really generous intro and welcome. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk with you about some of the things I've been thinking about recently and some of the work that I've been, engaging with, I guess I'll say, as it relates to African Americans in this history of the revolution and the 250th. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my screen share if I can. Let's see if I can get this right. Okay. So today I want to talk about the ways that people in the 19th century engaged with the history of the American Revolution. I want to talk about how they remembered it, how they told stories about it, how they worked with the revolution. In the process, what I want to suggest is that the work that African Americans did with the revolution shaped the meaning of that transformative moment, that they helped facilitate the sort of culmination or a move toward the culmination of the revolution's major ideas or ideals. I want to start, though, with what's probably the most infamous moment in the history of the Supreme Court. In March 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney issued his opinion in the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott had been enslaved in Virginia and Missouri, and then he spent several years with his owner in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory. And these are both places where slavery was illegal. Because he had spent time in those places, Dred Scott sued for his freedom. He said that he had been in places where slavery was illegal and therefore he should no longer be held in bondage. Roger Taney, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, denied Scott's claim. Taney said several things in his long opinion. One of the things he said was that the U.S. Constitution protected a slave owner's right to bring human property wherever he chose. And then on top of that, Taney made this larger, sweeping argument about African Americans and their place in the country. Taney said that Dred Scott could not file a suit because he was a black person. Here was the infamous statement that black men had no rights that white men were bound to respect. So this was not only a sweeping claim about racial inequality and its embeddedness in the country and its permanence, perhaps, for the nation. What Tawney was doing here was crafting his own version of a history of the revolution, of the revolutionary period. So when Tawney was faced with this question of Dred Scott's claims, Dred Scott's suit, what he said was that in order to determine whether Dred Scott had the right to sue, he should look back to the nation's beginning. And Tawney asked whether the founders had ever intended for black people to have rights. He said that the answer was no. Tawney said black people had been regarded as beings of an inferior order. He said that the Negro was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise. Tawney said, therefore, that black men had no rights, which white men were bound to respect. All these statements were about the past. In the Dred Scott case, Roger Tawney constructed a history of the nation's founding era, and he weaponized it. He used it to argue that black people must remain excluded. Confronted with this kind of thinking, African Americans drew on the same history to make radically different claims. One example of this, in November 1857, a few months after Roger Tawney's ruling, a black militia called the Liberty Guard held their first public parade in Boston. So the Liberty Guard was 50 black men who were dressed in uniforms and carrying weapons, and on this November day, marching through the city to demonstrate their manhood. In the evening, a group of black women hosted a party for the militia. A woman named Sarah Hill praised the Liberty Guard. She said that they had behaved like gentlemen and true, brave soldiers. Sarah Hill compared these soldiers to these militiamen, she compared them to black men who had served alongside George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And then she presented the captain with a gift, a silk flag that decades before someone had given to black Americans in tribute for their service in the Revolution. The flag featured an image of an eagle and a shield, but then someone had added onto it, had changed the physicality of the flag. They had sewn into the fabric the name Liberty Guard. So black Americans were using a militia in 1857 to remind people of their past service to the country. They were literally stitching themselves into the history of the founding era. So this is a different flag, but it's a useful emblem, another marker, another physical manifestation of this history of black military service. The history of the Revolution was an essential part of American politics in the 19th century. And so I want to focus there today, and specifically, I want to focus on the ways African Americans engaged with that history. When we do that, when we think about African American memory, we see three broad things. First, we'll see simply that Roger Tawney was wrong. Black people were recognized as essential participants during the Revolutionary period. It's true that most African Americans were enslaved when the nation was founding, but it's also true that that was far from the only possibility for their lives at that time. So one of the other major things we'll see is that history fostered black community in the 19th century. Engaging with shared stories about the past brought people together in the present. And then the last thing that I want to highlight or that I want to mention toward the end is that history and politics intersected in generative ways, productive, positive ways. The American Revolution was incomplete. And the work that African Americans did to enrich people's understanding of history was essential for moving the nation closer to the ideal of equality that was expressed in the nation's founding documents. Crispus Attucks lived in the 1850s. He was revived through the work of the Black historian William Cooper Nell and through the work of the wider anti-slavery community in Boston. Attucks had died in 1770, one of 5 colonists who were killed during the Boston Massacre. And Attucks was a dock worker, a fugitive slave. He was likely of mixed African and Native American parentage. Attucks shared with fellow Bostonians the anger that they felt at the British occupation, and really, in some ways, like the desperation that came from limited work. Crispus Attucks worked on the docks, but British blockades, British tax policies had limited the amount of work available for dock workers. And so Crispus Attucks and these other working Bostonians were angry, and they were upset about the circumstances in which they found themselves. So here we see Attucks represented at the center of the struggle between colonists and the British, really on the front line of what became called the Boston Massacre. We could compare this to Paul Revere's much earlier image of the Boston Massacre. Attucks is visible here. You see a black face in this engraving, but he's not at all central to the story that Revere is trying to tell visually. So when black activists, black and white activists, abolitionists reframed the image of the Boston Massacre, when they repositioned Crispus Attucks, it was important for them. And it was also aligned with some records from the period, records that described Attucks as being at the head of the crowd. This image was powerful for people who wanted to make an argument about the centrality, the literal centrality of Black people in the Revolutionary period. William Cooper Nell started researching the history of African American military service as early as the 1830s. And then he published books that described the contributions Black soldiers had made during the Revolution and also the War of 1812. As Nell framed it, Crispus Attucks was the foundation. He was the starting point for all subsequent Black military history. So William Cooper Nell decided to organize large public events to revive Attucks in spirit. In March 1858, he hosted the inaugural Crispus Attucks Day commemoration. In the advertisements, Nell emphasized that this gathering had a dual purpose. The people who were there were commemorating Black military service. They were remembering Attucks and the larger history of which he was a part. And they were also protesting Roger Taney's opinion in the Dred Scott case. So Taney was a powerful Roger Taney was a powerful individual. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a powerful symbol of the problem of racial inequality in the nation. And his opinion was outrageous to Black people and to many white Americans, abolitionists and not, right? But Roger Taney was just one symptom of a larger reality of racial inequality. The Chief Justice said Black people should have no formal legal rights. And in 1857, most of them did not. There were 4 million enslaved people in the country in 1860, and only about 500,000 free African Americans. So that free Black minority, even though they lived outside of bondage, they faced all sorts of constraints. Just a few examples of this. The Liberty Guard, the Black militia from Boston, was technically illegal. Joining a militia in the 19th century was an important form of civic participation. It was a way for people to engage with society. It was a way for men to demonstrate a particular vision of manliness, right? Like it was a way for them to make claims to rights and to equality based on this gendered perception of who they were as men, right? So militias were important socially and politically in the 19th century. But Massachusetts lawmakers barred Black men from joining militias or from creating their own. So when they formed the Liberty Guard and when they marched through the streets in public, this was a risky protest against that legal restriction. Another way to think about, or another example of some of these constraints, public schools in Massachusetts had been segregated by law until 1855. And so by the time of this parade, by the time of Nell's gathering, school desegregation was a recent victory for Black activists. The historian Stephen Kantrowitz tells some of this story in More Than Freedom. He offers a portrait of the community, of the people, teachers and students, black men and women who were involved in this political struggle, the effort to try to break down the principles or the practices of segregation in education in Massachusetts. So the problem of inequality existed across the northern states. Black men in Massachusetts could vote, but that was atypical in the 19th century. After 1821, New York required black men to own $250 worth of real estate in order to vote. And in the late 1830s, Pennsylvania outlawed black voting entirely. So more than just Roger Taney, more than just the Dred Scott decision, this pervasive reality of inequality is what brought William Cooper Nell and his colleagues together for Crispus Attucks Day. When Nell spoke to the gathered crowd, he said, "Notwithstanding the valor and sacrifices of both white and colored men in the struggles for liberty, the liberty of neither class is now safe." No one, Nell was saying, no one was truly free in this context of racial injustice. One of Nell's colleagues, a fellow black activist, John Rock, he said this a little bit more simply. Rock said, "Our fathers fought nobly for freedom, but they were not victorious." Still, black activists came together for Crispus Attucks Day commemorations. They came together because they believed that the revolution's failure did not have to be final. On the stage that day, Nell displayed a set of artifacts that he had collected in his research. Among these was the flag of the Bucks of America. But there were also some stranger objects. One of the things that he had on the stage was a small cup owned by Crispus Attucks. So people in the 19th century, they thought, and really people in the 18th century, in the revolutionary period itself, people saw the victims of the Boston Massacre as martyrs. And Attucks was the first martyr. So something that he had owned, a thing that had touched his lips, that cup, it was a sacred relic in this setting. Nell talked about the service of other black men alongside Attucks. He talked about the military contributions. In the book, The Colored Patriots, he broke this down kind of state by state and just offered a catalog of all the things that black men had done to contribute to the Revolutionary War. And so whenever Nell spoke in public, he would pull out some of these examples, some of these stories. Nell also displayed a set of documents. These were not necessarily records of service in battle, but records of military life more broadly. One of these documents was a letter from the Revolution in which a U.S. Army captain had described having to arrest a lieutenant. The lieutenant was charged with abusing a colored soldier. He didn't specify, but there was abuse and there was punishment. So it might seem like a minor thing, but this was a record from the Revolutionary period that described a black person being harmed and then also receiving relief from an authority figure. Together, the objects that Nell had gathered, they represented a history of the American Revolution in which black people performed valuable service and in which they were recognized as people who were entitled to justice. All this showed that Roger Taney was simply wrong. His history was woefully incomplete, and so his legal arguments, the argument went, his legal arguments were worthless. For Nell, Crispus Attucks Day was a chance to prove that black people deserved equality. But by the 1850s, some of his colleagues were tired of having to make those kinds of arguments. They were tired of having to prove their worth. They've been doing that for decades. And so they were skeptical of some of these stories of black patriotism. They didn't disagree that these things had happened. They disagreed with the idea that they should continue leaning on these stories of black people's dedication to the United States. So one of the speakers, one of the people on the dais with William Cooper Nell said, "There was a time when I took pride in the efforts and in the blood that was shed by black men during the Revolution." Apparently, implicitly, that time had passed. John Rock, again, was more direct. Rock said, I have learned that even as late as the Texan War, this is referring to the Mexican-American War of the late 1840s, even as late as the Texan War, a number of black men were found silly enough to offer themselves as living sacrifices for our country's shame. What was the value of black patriotism? These men asked. What was the value of that when people were fighting on behalf of a slaveholders' republic? Nell's colleagues suggested that they look for role models in people who had fought for the principle of black freedom rather than for just the nation, the United States itself. So that might be slave rebels from Haiti, or it might be abolitionists who had used violence to defend fugitive slaves, like the people who had helped to rescue the fugitive slave Jerry in Syracuse. They said that these rebels, especially the anti-slavery activists in the United States, they said that these folks had opened the revolution of the present when they took up arms against enslavers. So there's this vision here of recognizing that the revolution was incomplete and also asserting that it was ongoing, that it would be renewed as people took on new tactics, new techniques in this long struggle in pursuit of true freedom within the United States. So this kind of argument, so Nell says, let's celebrate Crispus Attucks, and then these other guys say, I'm not really sure about that, right? This was typical of black politics at the time. People disagreed about political tactics, but the speakers at Crispus Attucks Day were in agreement that Roger Taney was wrong. In this event and in others like it, black activists were constructing a counter-memory of the revolution. They were telling a fuller story about the lives that African Americans had led and the contributions that they had made in the founding era. In the process, constructing this counter memory, it was encouraging American people to contemplate a more diverse and a more accurate version of the nation's past. Black Americans, black activists use that history, the history that Nell had helped to construct, they use that history to encourage people to imagine an alternate future. So as I was thinking about this idea of a counter memory, I was thinking about this later context and this really recent book by Rob Bland about Reconstruction, about post-emancipation history in South Carolina, essentially making the argument that the ways Black folks remembered the Civil War and remembered Reconstruction, that these were essential elements of their efforts to build a political coalition and to challenge basically the effort to solidify white supremacy in the aftermath of emancipation. So I'm not going to go too far into the 1860s and beyond here, but I will say one little thing here because there's an interesting Civil War connection to Crispus Attucks Day. So in 1863, the celebration of Crispus Attucks Day featured members of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, probably the most famous regiment of Black soldiers recruited from across the North during the Civil War. So this moment, 1863, this was a full circle celebration of Black military contributions. And also, it's likely that the U.S. military was hoping this celebration, this Crispus Attucks Day, would help them recruit more Black soldiers for the ongoing struggle against the Southern Rebellion. So all this is to say that African Americans' memory of the revolution was part of a long-term project that was designed to try to reshape the nation's laws and build a better future. But it's also important that people understood this as a path to a more fulfilling present. African Americans' memories of the revolution were connected to a flourishing community life in northern cities. The 1858 Crispus Attucks Day commemoration was a cultural event. Nell told people that they could buy a ticket for 75 cents, and that ticket would include an evening of entertainment. There were pianists and choirs and a band. There was a reception and there was dancing. You could also note here at the bottom, it says that there's a coat check for ladies and gentlemen's apparel. There are all these ways in which Nell was really trying to cultivate a community celebration. This was a space for Black folks to learn, to engage with the past, and also to have fun, to enjoy a night out together. Other types of sort of reflections on military history, other aspects of this also were about, they were in themselves, they were community events. So Black militias would draw crowds and cultivate community celebrations. Think about the party that happened after the Liberty Guards parade, but also think about the parade itself, which drew an audience of Black supporters. The militia marched and Black folks lined up to watch and to cheer. In many cases, Black militias from this period connected themselves explicitly to the history of the Revolution. Across the Northeast, Black folks created military companies, including the Attucks Guards and the Attucks Blues. So there's all these ways in which they were recognizing that their actions in the 1850s were drawing on and extending this history of the Revolutionary period. That was important for the claims that they wanted to make about themselves and their place in the country. The militias were also committed to entertaining their supporters. In August 1858, a different militia parade took place in New Bedford, Massachusetts. There, folks came together and watched what was described as a handsome military display. And this featured the Liberty Guard and also other militia groups from New Bedford. The organizers of the parade provided light refreshments, and then they led the crowd down to the coast where, the records say, a grand chowder was served. And for those who didn't really want to sit down and eat soup outside in August, they could join a different parade. And that was a group of Black sailors who marched and then led their followers to a celebration that ended in a park where there was a clam bake. In events like this, in these parades, in these gatherings, in these celebrations, in these events, Black Americans luxuriated in the public space of northern towns and cities. When militias marched and when their followers cheered, this was a public show of disdain for Black exclusion and a public celebration of the real history of Black military service. So these gatherings made political statements, but they were also moments of joy. Free Black people had the pleasure of spending a day with people who shared their interests, of watching a parade, the pleasure of lounging in the park on a warm afternoon. These gatherings were moments when people had space to talk. So maybe they would talk about the injustice or the illogic of Roger Taney's Dred Scott decision. Maybe they would talk about strategies to confront it. But maybe they would also just talk about the colors of the flowers that they saw blooming. Or they would talk about how nice it was to sit outside near the water and eat fresh clams. Historians of slavery like Stephanie Camp have written about how important it was for bound people to create spaces where they could be together. These could be hidden religious ceremonies, they could be secret dance parties, they could be strategy sessions for people who were considering escape or rebellion. More recently, Tara Bynum has written about the importance of joy and pleasure for free Black Northerners. Gatherings for celebrations that were shaped by the memory of the Revolution were spaces where Black people could contemplate ways to make their lives more just and equal in the long term, but also places where they could experience their lives with a little bit more joy in the immediate term. So what's important here is and this is partly just me and the evolution of my thinking and my scholarly interests. I think I have been often, and I think a lot of us are often drawn to think about Black history in terms of oppression and opposition to that oppression, right? Constraint and resistance. But I think it's also useful, as these scholars have suggested, it's useful and it's richer to think about the experience of Black life beyond that contest over oppression. Doing so gives us a fuller picture of the realities of Black humanity. So we could also think about one other sort of community element of this. We could think about the folks who were gathered for Crispus Attucks Day as a community that was built around a shared education. At this celebration, Nell arranged his artifacts on stage and he invited people to walk up and look at them closely. So they had the opportunity to develop their own interpretations, their own conclusions about these artifacts, about the Black past. And they could talk among themselves about the Revolution. In a sense, these folks who came to Crispus Attucks Day, they were in school together for a brief moment. Thinking about this, I was also considering this recent book by Sarah Groningsater, which has highlighted the importance of Black schools as foundations for community development. Groningsater traces people who were students together at New York's African Free School and follows them through a generation as they went on to work together in various activist projects in subsequent decades. There's a way in which I think learning together, school cultivates community in part because people are cultivating a shared base of knowledge, and that kind of creates a kind of an intellectual connection among these folks. So I don't want to say that the memory of the revolution created a particular type of Black community. People already had connections that allowed them to collaborate to plan these kinds of events. And also, you need a community in which you can expect that if you're William Cooper Nell and you put this event on, you got to expect that your friends and neighbors are going to show up, right? So there's already some pre-existing connections. There is a community in Boston that is open to these kinds of events. But when African Americans remembered the revolution, they created moments when these communities could flourish, when the day-to-day work of being connected with others could take a more spectacular form, making the public statement that the United States was home for thousands of Black people. So I want to just make maybe a couple more brief points before I wrap up. As he was researching and publishing accounts of African American military service, William Cooper Nell participated in the creation of African American history as a field of study. To create this work, Nell described, and I'm quoting him here, journeys to confer with the living and even pilgrimages to graveyards. So already, this is a thread or a theme in recent conversations about African American history, about history generally, but about Black history in particular, like the challenge of working with the archive, right? The records are not always there, and the records were in some ways intentionally constructed to obscure some of the fuller reality of African Americans' experiences. So Nell was noting the challenges of the archive. He said that he was trying to collect shreds and patches, and that he was chasing after fast disappearing records. Nell was one of the first people to sit and focus on the history of African Americans. And so the field of African American history grew in part from this politicized memory of Black service. Nell's work was radical. And part of the radicalism was the simple choice to explore the history of Black people as people. One of the other architects, one of the early, a century later, but still one of the early and important figures in constructing African American history was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois crafted his book, Black Reconstruction in America, and as he did so, he identified this same driving impulse. His goal was to show that Black folks were people, to think about them in their fullness, and to try to highlight their experiences. What Du Bois said was that he would tell this story as though Negroes were ordinary human beings. Again, a straightforward statement, but in the 1930s, as it was in the 1850s, a radical claim for a scholar to make in their effort to study, to understand the past. So the point that I want to make here, the thread that I'm sketching, is one in which history is political. It's invested with significance in the contemporary context. And this is not me saying that historians are always working with some kind of agenda, or that they're always they're always sort of poisoned by their own biases. The point here is that in the case of the American Revolution had a long and potent afterlife. The past is the foundation on which people build their present. And so the ways we make sense of the past, the ways we interpret it, the arguments that we draw from it, our ideas about the past are necessarily going to be a terrain of struggle. So working with the revolution, as African Americans did, working with the revolution challenged Roger Taney. It helped to foster African American community. And working with the revolution planted the seeds of African American history as a discipline. to me, what I see here is how productive, how generative it can be intellectually and politically, how generative it can be to simply tell a full and true story about the American past. That's what William Cooper Nell was doing here at Crispus Attucks Day. And I think that's an important model for us to think about as we contemplate how we want to engage with the revolutionary past in our 250th present. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you for your time. And I look forward to hearing thoughts, questions, comments. Thank you.
Oh, Chris, that was great. I was scribbling so fast to take notes. I'm not usually like
Hopefully I
taking
wasn't
lots of
talking
notes
too
on this.
fast, but
Like that was really, really great. Um, uh, Folks who are with us, you may certainly add questions in the Q&A, and then I will pass them over to Dr. Bonner. I'm going to just like Zoom has changed the format for me to find those. But anyway, okay, you can put questions in there. But I'm going to start. I've got a couple of things to ask you about. Um, that was just really interesting. Thank you.
cool.
I want to start by just asking you about some of the things that we've been hearing a lot about in this year of 2026 in thinking about the Black politics of revolution. Often we hear about uh, the questions about the Declaration of Independence, what's in it, what's the inherent promise of the Declaration,
Mm.
and what is the promise unfulfilled that's noticed in the immediate instance of its production. So, for example, Jamel Bouie's recent column in the New York Times, which talks about how many petitioners wrote in the moment of the Declaration, like, look, you know, whether it's Prince Hall or others saying, look, you know, the Declaration says all people are free, and yet here so many people are enslaved. Explain that, fix that. In other
Mm.
words, there is what you're talking about is a history and a tradition of finding the historical roots for liberation. And also, often we are hearing in the moment of the revolution a call to confront the contradictions of
Mhm.
the liberatory language of the Declaration. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you could just talk about these like two different pieces. They're so interesting. And then I want to ask you a follow-on question.
Yeah, I guess I this is a big one, right? And I think it's and I in some ways it's like this is central to African American history across time, right? Across the time of the nation is this combination of recognizing and critiquing the founding documents and really the laws for their
Mm-hmm.
limitations, but also seeing them as a critical foundation for all kinds of political claims, right? And in some ways, I think that tension is really it's in those petitions from the 1770s and 1780s, right? We don't even have to really look to the 1850s to see African Americans really saying two things about the Declaration. They're saying that the petitioners for freedom are saying that this is a beautiful document outlining these high and transformative ideals. To say that human equality is a foundation for a state, for a government, that was radical, right? That they're celebrating the possibilities of that document, but then they're also saying, but the practice is radically different, right? And that's that's always the tension that folks are identifying is that there is this statement, there's this set of claims. You know, it's like the nation is representing itself here in one way, but then the reality, the day-to-day, the lived experience, especially of African Americans, is just fundamentally different. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's all like the a critique of a nation for failing to live up to its founding creed is in some ways inherently a celebration of that founding moment.
Of that creed.
And I think
Yeah.
it's just an interesting reality that there's always that those things are happening together. And so it is it's one of these it's a standby in the repertoire of Black protest to say
Yeah.
look back at the founding and I love these things, but like what are you doing with them? Essentially
Yeah.
is the question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super interesting because so let me ask the follow-on question, which is Roger Taney essentially reaches for the worst version of the founding documents. He reaches for the anti-liberatory potential of the founding documents. So
Hmm.
it's just interesting to me that sometimes we hear when people talk about how we should understand the founding as either inherently contradictory or it should only be, narrated as a positive good or whatever simplistic, renderings. It's so interesting that Tawny, in fact, is the one who reaches for that simplistic negative interpretation
Hmm.
of the founding.
Yeah, well, and I think in some ways it's what Tawny's doing is trying to uphold his particular vision, right? This is the critique of Tawny is that he's definitely not doing history, but that he's not even really doing the work of reasoning from the Constitution. He has in his mind a commitment to preserving slavery. And really extending slavery to allowing it to go wherever slave owners want to bring enslaved people. And so he looks into the past and tries to construct an image that will support that case. I had thought about mentioning this, and I think I cut it in the interest of time, but there's um, one of the things that's complicated or difficult about the Dred Scott decision is that there is a there's a compelling kind of truth in Roger Taney's claims, right? The founders sketched out this vision of a nation defined by human equality, but the vast majority of African Americans were slaves when the nation was founded. And technically, those people had no formal legal rights. The most of the people who were leading figures at the nation's earliest years, most of them did think about Black people as simple articles of merchandise, right? And so um, I think, Karen, I think this is part of your point is that Tony doesn't have to like look hard to find support for his claims. Uh, what he has to do that is, if he were intellectually honest, what he has to do that is hard is to ignore all of the other
The
realities
rest of
of
it.
what Black life was, right? And so that's the choice that he's making. But he's pulling from all kinds of different sources in colonial law and common law and things to support his claims. But you really don't have to look that hard to find evidence of white supremacy at the nation's founding. Uh, Taney's the real work he was doing was erasing or trying to erase the richer, more complex reality.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many ways in which I so appreciate the way you articulated the significance of doing historical work, and also the relationship of history to politics. That is, history is inherently political, but that doesn't mean that one acts to locate a history that is necessarily the one you need to deliver for your politics.
Yeah,
I
right.
thought that
Yeah.
was
Yeah,
really
it's not
important.
history, it's just recognizing that there is this kind of foundational uh desire or need to feel to sort of make sense of the present based on the past. And so there's always going to be it's always going to be meaningful in our world, like what we say about what happened to bring us as a nation or as people to this point. And so I think that's kind of where you get into the politics is that there's people, essentially, the short way to say this is like people care about how we tell stories about the past.
Yes, they
And
do.
yeah, which is, it's good, I guess. But then it can make things complicated. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to, last week I was at Houghton Library for a moment of research. It was blissful. But among other things, in their 250 exhibit, I did not know this. I've seen many things that they had there. They had some fantastic print examples, but they also had Lemuel Haynes, manuscript Liberty Further Extended. And I didn't
Hmm.
know it was going to be there. And I was like,
Yeah.
I've taught that about a billion times, but that's a really potent expression right in the moment of a
Hmm.
kind of abolitionist sentiment of ex- thinking about liberty in its most moral, in his case, kind of this biblical argument. But I wonder how you think about the sort of long history there from the moment of revolution of these powerful expressions of Black politics, like Haynes, all the way through what you're talking about, really honestly through Reconstruction. Like,
Mm,
I mean, that's a very big question. But like
yeah,
these um these articulations are so formative, I think, in the American consciousness right now. No one
mm,
can greet July 4th without encountering Frederick Douglass
yeah,
anymore, right?
right,
And at least I feel like I saw Lemuel Haynes a lot this year
yeah,
anyway. Maybe we
mm,
will see it more. But that's a long trajectory of rhetorical
yeah.
intensity
Mm.
around the revolution.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's really it's like the I guess part of what's interesting to me about it is and this is I know a constitutional debate that it's sort of out of like I'm out of my depth in touching on it, but there is this question about like whether the Declaration has any legal weight in terms of the shaping of the nation. And I think that it's I don't know, it's interesting because I think politically there's a lot of debate among African Americans and engagement with the Constitution, but politically, I think it's probably clear that the Declaration is much more pervasive in terms of the ways that African Americans conceptualize their position and sort of challenge the inequalities that they're facing. Part of that is because of the clarity of the concept of independence and the centrality of that to people who are, their central politics is contesting slavery. But then there's also the sharpness, really the substance of this claim to broad human equality, right? That's a thing that's going to be foundational for the work that African Americans are doing. I guess it's I guess what I'm thinking about, I would have to think about this a little bit more. Um, I'm always struck by like moments like I sketched here where Nell says, "Oh yeah, we should celebrate Black patriotism, right? Remember Crispus Attucks." And then his colleagues standing on stage next to him are saying, "No, like let's think about other folks. Let's consider other models." So I'm always interested in these moments of contest and argument within Black politics because that gets you to something about like what people really value, right? Those disagreements. I want to say I shouldn't say this on recording because I don't want to be quoted on it, but I almost feel like there's a lot more argument within Black activist circles about the Constitution than there is about the
Mm,
Declaration.
mm,
Like I think that there's a lot of agreement on the value, the potency of the Declaration of Independence, and in the way that the Constitution, maybe because the Constitution is in so many ways instrumental for upholding the institution of slavery. There's a
mm,
lot more um, disagreement over the language of the Constitution and sort of skepticism about whether that should be invoked. But there's something about the Declaration that feels, my sense is that it feels more like generally accessible and almost acceptable to Black folks
mm.
in the early 19th century. So I don't know. I would want to look into that more, but now I've said it. So
Well, do you think this is actually going to be part of my next question, which is about and I just first want to express appreciation for how you articulated that importance of um, I get not I don't want to downplay politics by saying not just politics, but your emphasis on community and on
yeah.
joy and on mutual experience. Do you think that's because some of what you're talking about here is that the language and the ideas of the Declaration are good for community joy
Mm, yeah.
in ways that the
Yeah.
Constitution is great, but maybe it
Yeah.
doesn't kind of sing the same
Yeah. The
way.
law, the law is different from the ideal, right? In terms of just like the things to celebrate. Yeah, I think that there's something interesting there, right? That it's um the Declaration's function was, it was treason, it was an act of war in some ways, right? But it was also just a statement of a set of values, and
Mm,
that's gonna um feel different. It's gonna sound different to African
mm,
Americans, and I think that I don't know, there's also something about uh the necessarily, I don't know if this is about the Declaration itself, but thinking about the things that Black folks were celebrating in these events, um, 50 guys could have got together in Boston and said, we're the Liberty Guard, but it doesn't really mean anything if they don't go out in public, right? And in the same way,
Hmm.
like Crispus Attucks and these dock workers, and they probably could have sat in a bunch of taverns and complained, but the thing that made that a political event was going out in the streets and
Hmm.
doing it, right? And so there's like a um something about these events was there's like a necessary public like
Hmm.
open dimension of what these folks were doing, whether it was the protests that then culminated in the massacre, or these militia gatherings. And so I think that's part of what just the things require people to come together, and that
Yeah.
and produces the moments of joy. And I guess I would say I don't want to ramble too much, but I don't know if it was if you noticed when I was showing a couple times the headline that was describing the Liberty Guard parade, the it was a celebration, and there are all these
Yeah.
followers, black followers who are with them, but it was also a fight. So the Liberty Guard comes together and they start marching through the city, and these black folks, maybe they knew about this or maybe they just see them and they start following. And then there's a group of angry white Bostonians who are essentially assaulting the followers and then ultimately the guards. They start throwing
Mm.
pebbles and then rocks, and eventually they rip up pieces of cobblestones from the streets and start throwing them at the Liberty Guard. And the guardsmen say, you know
Mm.
what, that's enough. They turn around, they pull out their bayonets, and they chase these white guys away, right? And so there is again, it's like that's a moment of celebration, like they have defended themselves and their community, but it's also, I think, a reflection of um, the difficulties and the dangers of these kinds of public gatherings. When Black folks got together and walked through the streets of their cities or their towns, they made themselves vulnerable. And so it was not it's not a simple kind of party.
Yeah.
Even as I think it's important to emphasize the celebratory elements of what they were doing.
Yeah. There's joy, but
Yeah, it's
it's
fraught.
not cheaply bought.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah.
I think that the question about Crispus Attucks Day is super interesting, and it's so arresting the way you contrasted um, right there. Um, well, the Liberty, I guess, 1857, the Liberty Guard and Tawny, but then right away, the kind of Crispus Attucks Day, super interesting in talking about what William Cooper Nell was doing with this kind of with this history.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you about other kinds of figures of the revolution and how they may or may not have resonated into the 19th century.
Mhm.
Because in this in this year of commemoration, we've also heard more about a group of people that Benjamin Quarles wrote about a long time ago, which is the
Yeah,
kind of Black loyalists,
yeah.
people choosing to be with the British because the British offer to them actual freedom.
Hmm.
Um, and what you think about in the mid 19th century colonization societies
Hmm.
and the fate of those Black loyalists, many whom take off for Liberia, or
Hmm.
the kinds of and the struggles to found societies um,
Hmm.
back in Africa.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that contrast between that recovering a Black patriot like
Hmm.
Attucks and these kinds of recognitions of a different kind of freedom seeking during the
Yeah.
revolutionary period?
Yeah, this is interesting. And in some ways this is like um the disagreement between William Cooper Nell and John Rock about like should we celebrate these patriots? It's
Mm,
at its heart, in some ways, it's like a question of it's a disagreement over whether African Americans should feel bound to the United States as a nation. And
mm,
that was a fundamental contest or source of tension from the early 1800s, or really, as you're pointing out, from the Revolution beyond, right? So Quarles makes the argument. Benjamin Quarles, I got him here. This literal
what a great
classic
book.
in African
Yep.
American history, The Negro in the American Revolution. Quarles makes the argument that African Americans during the Revolution were loyal to a principle. They were loyal to the possibility of their own freedom. And so there are many folks who seek refuge with the British, who fight with the British, and there are many others, countless others, who join the Patriots and fight with them. But there's not really a lot to suggest that when an enslaved person runs away from Mount Vernon, there's not much to suggest that they're choosing the British versus the Patriots because they have a loyalty to the king, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
not, right? It's about the possibility, the opportunity that the war creates for them to pursue their freedom. The tension, um, the tension that you see between Nell and Rock is this sense, essentially, like Nell and countless other Black activists across the early 19th century would say the heart of possibility for us to improve our lives is the nation, the United States, the a nation built on the founding language of the Declaration and the founding governmental structure of the Constitution. That is our best bet in pursuit of equality. John Rock says, it's nice, but look at, what have you done for me lately? But like, look at all of the realities of Black history, right? And so Rock is more in this moment skeptical of the idea that that the United States is the only possibility, the only place through which Black folks can improve themselves. I don't actually know if Rock ends up embracing emigration or thinking about
Mm.
leaving the country. The real the so sort of what breaks down the um this juxtaposition of uh Black loyalists and Black patriots in the Revolution and the juxtaposition of that with Nell and Rock in the 1850s is that um Black folks who sought opportunity with the British during the Revolution, they were connecting themselves with another institution. And one of the
Mm.
outcomes of that is that many of those who survived the war are brought to Canada and then
Yeah.
on to Sierra Leone in West Africa.
Yeah.
Uh, the challenge with colonization in the 19th century was that African Americans, even if they were, like John Rock or others, like a little bit skeptical of binding themselves to the US, they were even more skeptical of an organized group of white people who said, here is your destination. And in the case of the American Colonization Society, here, you should go
Yes.
to Liberia, right? And so
Yes.
people were open to going elsewhere, but they wanted to be able to do it as a choice, right? They wanted to say,
Yeah.
okay, I'm going to go and set up a Black community in Canada, or, I'm going to think about going to Haiti. Or, maybe I'm going to go to Liberia, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily want to do that with this group of
Mm-hmm.
white folks who say, you African Americans don't belong, right? And so that's
Mm-hmm.
I think that I don't think that Rock, even as he was a little skeptical of the nation in 1858, I don't think he would have said, hey, we all should have been Black loyalists in 1777, right? So I think that's maybe a way to think about it. Yeah.
That is super helpful, really, really helpful. Chris, I need to say that I feel like in this series, we have covered a whole lot of different topics around the
Mhm.
American Revolution. Um, and probably one of the most important and the one that we are living and wrestling with and is in the news every single day is this question of what is the distinction between history and memory and how do we fight over that? And I can't think of a better way to talk about that than what you've given us today.
Yeah.
Really important.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that what you talked about in terms of these ideas will necessarily be a terrain of struggle. So profound.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank
I'm,
you.
I'm glad to do it. And, I don't know how well my ideas are developed on that, but I think it's something that I feel like is important. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad to be able to talk about it.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, take care. Thank you all for joining us. Bye bye.